Canadian-U.S. softwood lumber dispute can be viewed through a codependency approach. Both the United States and Canada are codependent of one another in this dispute. The United States can only supply 70% of its needed softwood lumber and depends on Canada to fulfill the remaining 30% of their demands. Canada also depends on the United States as its largest trading partner and needs them as a reliable trading partner in order to export its vast amounts of softwood lumber. Because the softwood lumber industry makes up $22 billion of Canada's GDP, it is very dependent on trade with the United States.
The Canada-U.S. softwood lumber dispute is one of the most enduring trade disputes between Canada and the United States. The dispute first arose in 1982 with a complaint by the U.S. lumber industry. The industry argued that the Canadian government unfairly subsidized the growing of Canadian softwood timber, transformed it into lumber, and exported it to the U.S. This is due to the difference in pricing mechanisms between the two countries. In Canada, provinces own most of the forest resources and administer the rates. 94% of provinces are provincially or federally owned lands, and therefore they can set the price lower than the market rate. In the United States, most U.S. resources are privately owned and prices are set by the market. In total, 70% of forest lands in the U.S. are privately owned. For over 25 years, the United States lumber industry has frequently sought U.S. government restrictions on Canadian softwood lumber imports. They have done so through the application of U.S. countervailing duties and anti-dumping laws. In 2006, Canada and the U.S. signed the 2006 Softwood Lumber Agreement, which was in place until its expiration in October 2015. The U.S. Department of Commerce agreed to not undertake new countervailing or anti-dumping duty investigations against Canadian softwood lumber products for 1 year following the expiry of the SLA. The 1 year period expired in October 2016. Currently, there is no new deal that has been negotiated since the SLA.
The U.S. Department of Commerce has been responsible for the oversight of investigations and adherence of softwood lumber trade with Canada since 1903. Uniquely, the softwood lumber industry in the United States is private, with a handful of large lumber firms dominating its activity. As a result of this, the U.S. Lumber Coalition for Fair Imports was established in 1985, designed to protect the U.S. domestic lumber industry and lobby against lumber imports that may threaten to undercut its economic growth and impact on the overall economy.
The main actors in Canada responsible for dealing with the Canada-U.S. softwood lumber dispute are the Government of Canada, Global Affairs Canada, and the Canadian Ministry of Trade. The Government of Canada plays a large role in this trade dispute as it both owns and subsidizes the land which softwood lumber is produced on.
The primary argument raised by the U.S. softwood lumber industry has to do with the Canadian government's pricing practices, specifically how the land with which Canadian companies manufacture and produce softwood lumber is owned and subsidized by the Canadian government. As a result, Canadian softwood lumber is significantly cheaper than that of privately owned U.S. softwood lumber, as the market determines the price for softwood lumber in the U.S. Between January and June of 2017, the U.S. Department of Commerce saw a 61% increase in the number of investigations into Canadian infringements of U.S. anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws, on top of the 401 outstanding investigations into the matter. The majority of these investigations were prompted by the U.S. Lumber Coalition for Fair Imports, arguing that Canadian softwood lumber imports were being sold at rates which were far below that of fair value. In November 2017, Secretary of the Department of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, wrote an article affirming that West Canadian imports of softwood lumber were indeed being sold between 3 and 9% less than fair value. This was viewed as a direct threat to the growth and sustainability of the U.S. softwood lumber industry. Both the Coalition and the Department of Commerce noted that stricter enforcement of existing laws and the need for a new lumber agreement were at the forefront of Canada-U.S. softwood lumber trade.
The softwood lumber industry is an important sector in the Canadian economy, supporting thousands of jobs in communities across Canada. Currently, the majority of Canadian softwood lumber exports go to the United States. In the past, Canada successfully challenged U.S. actions under the dispute resolution provisions of the World Trade Organization, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and before United States courts. Ottawa launched a complaint saying it would forcefully defend its lumber industry against U.S. tariffs, which it said were unfair, unwarranted, and deeply troubling. The U.S. argues that low stumpage rates constitute a subsidy that has allowed Canadian producers to gain an unfair advantage over U.S. counterparts, to which Canada has repeatedly denied doing. Canada has argued that the reasons why lumber exports to the U.S. continue to go up are not any unfair practices, but actually due to the exchange rate advantage, superior production efficiency, and U.S. consumers' preference for superior quality Canadian lumber. Canada has criticized the U.S. for its April 2017 decision to impose duties on softwood lumber and has initiated challenges with the WTO. It is unacceptable that the United States continues to place tariffs on one of its closest allies. The likely outcomes of the dispute for Canada will be increased international exports of softwood lumber. For example, Chinese imports of Canadian softwood lumber are expected to increase because of Canada's new associate position in the Pacific Alliance. There will also likely be increased arbitration with the WTO and under Chapter 19 of the USMCA, formerly the North American Free Trade Agreement. As well, there has been an increase in profitability for large softwood lumber producers in Canada as a result of the high demand of the US housing market. Overall, there was an 8% decrease in Canadian exports of softwood lumber to the US in 2017 as a result of these tariffs.
For the United States, the likely outcomes of this dispute will be an increase in the domestic cost of softwood lumber, with most of this burden being placed on the U.S. consumer. To conclude, there will likely be many more challenges to the Canada-U.S. lumber trade involving dispute resolutions with the World Trade Organization, until a sufficient update to the Softwood Lumber Agreement has been signed and implemented.